Hey everyone, welcome to part 2 of my tutorial on La Campanella. In this section, we're going to be looking at all the 30-second note sections in the middle of the piece. This part is a bit like soup. There are lots of ingredients involved in making it work, and even once you've got them all cooking, it might still need a while to simmer. Also, it's usually best when warmed up. Let's take a look at what some of those ingredients might be. Here's a slow motion clip. One of the most obvious things to talk about here is probably the fingering. The standard fingering is to put 1 on the low note, then 4, 3, 2 on the higher notes. For the most part, this is what I do, but with one exception. For the second group in each measure, instead, I play 1, 4, 3, 4. This is because going all the way to finger 2 pulls my whole hand, including my thumb, quite far to the right. Usually this is fine because my thumb needs to be moving to the right anyway, but between the second and third groups, the distance my thumb needs to travel is very small. So if I go all the way to finger 2, I end up overshooting the note, and my thumb has to scramble to get back down on time. If your hands are big enough, 1, 4, 3, 2 is probably still a better fingering, as it does make the repeated note slightly easier. But for smaller hands, I find that it's worth the trade-off to make the thumb movement more efficient. So let's take a look at that clip again, and this time we'll follow what the thumb is doing. In the first group, playing 1, 4, 3, 2 sets my thumb up almost perfectly to start the second group. Then, as I start to play 1, 4, 3, 4, my thumb does come slightly too far to the right. But by the time I play the last repeated note, with 4, my thumb has made its way back to the C sharp and is ready to go. For the next two groups, my thumb has to travel pretty far between sets, so 1, 4, 3, 2 works nicely again. Okay, so let's take a look at what I'm doing with my wrist. As I play these first 4 notes, my hand is already turned fairly far to the right, but as I leap to the first high note, my hand turns even farther. This gets my 4th, 3rd, and 2nd fingers pretty close to the key they're about to play without requiring my thumb to move just yet. Then I maintain this angle as I play the repeated notes, allowing my thumb to move into place for the next group, as I've already discussed. I should probably mention that although my hand is turned fairly far to the right, it's not quite at the limit of my wrist's range of motion. I wouldn't recommend turning your hand to the point where it feels uncomfortable, as that could lead to injury. Also, as soon as I have the opportunity, I'm returning to a neutral wrist at the end of the measure. I know I'm spending a lot of time on this passage, but if you're learning the piece, chances are so will you. So let me just mention a few more things before we go on. As you may have already noticed, for the most part I'm playing pretty close to the front edges of the keys. This is usually ideal because it gives me better leverage, but when my thumb has to go to a black key, my other fingers do slide slightly farther back. As with most things in piano technique, choosing how far forward or back to put your fingers is a bit of a compromise, but the takeaway here is to be as aware as possible of your finger placement and to make choices with overall efficiency in mind. For a piece this difficult, a few millimeters adjustment to each finger placement can be all it takes to make or break a passage. Because I have to stretch so far to get up to the 4th finger, my fingers naturally want to flatten out a bit. I can't avoid it completely, but I do try to limit the extent to which they're flattening out. For precise, fingery passages like this, I always find that I have more control over my fingers when I can maintain a bit of height in these knuckles. This is also a compromise, as flatter fingers provide more stretch, whereas curved fingers give better control. But if you're struggling with this passage, this is one more variable you might consider tweaking. Finally, like I mentioned with the repeated notes in part 1 of this tutorial, I'm actually playing them staccato, and I really focus on releasing each key as quickly as I can after playing it. Even at 1/4 playback speed, notice how fast my fingers are traveling when they leave each key. I find that it helps to think about making my finger movements as big as possible. This is a bit counterintuitive, as I'm usually all about efficiency and eliminating excess movement, but with repeated notes specifically, the biggest bottleneck is how fast the action can reset to allow for repetition, so my movements need to help facilitate that. More generally, I guess the takeaway here is that the most efficient movement is not always the smallest movement. Oh, I guess I haven't mentioned these chromatic things yet, but those aren't hard. Surely nobody would ever mess those up. Well, that is unfortunate. Well, there you have it. That's my recipe for this repeated note passage. In my opinion, this is definitely one of the hardest parts of the piece, so try not to get discouraged if it doesn't come together right away. Oh, also I should probably mention that I definitely prioritize clarity over speed here, as I think that really clean, clear playing at a moderately fast tempo usually sounds better than super fast but sloppy playing. But do whatever you want. Next we come to this trill section. There are actually a number of different figurations being used here, so let's take a look at each of them individually. Here I play all the trills in the right hand with 3 and 5, and the moving lines entirely with my thumb. Most of the movement comes from forearm rotation. Notice how the top of my hand is moving quite a bit as I rotate my forearm, but there's actually very little movement in the finger joints. This is because fingers 4 and 5 are pretty much useless, and the only way I can play fast trills involving either one of them is to use my hand and arm to generate most of the movement. Basically, all I'm actually doing with the fingers is tensing up just enough to avoid letting any of the joints collapse, and then releasing that tension the moment it's no longer needed. I like to think of my fingers as being lazy but stubborn. They don't want to do any more work than they have to, but they also aren't about to let anyone push them around. Another thing I do to make these weak finger trills a little easier is to think of lifting completely and relaxing all the tension in my hand between each group. This might be more mental than physical, but building in these little planned relaxation points helps me to play passages like this without holding on to too much tension. The most noticeable of these lifts is probably the one right at the end of the second measure. Here, I'm coming from playing B and G sharp with fingers 1 and 3, which for my little hands is quite a stretch. This stretched position flattens out my fingers quite a bit, and I don't feel like I can get good enough leverage to play the next 3 notes from this position. So I lift my whole hand and release the stretch. By the time I play the D sharp, I've lifted this knuckle quite a bit, closed my hand to a comfortable position, and got my thumb ready to go to the E. At 1/4 playback speed, this gap is pretty audible. But at full tempo, the gap practically disappears. For these guys, you've got 2 main options. Either play them as written, all with the right hand, or do what I do, which is to redistribute, taking the low notes with the left hand. Either way is fine, but I find it a bit easier to use both hands. Later on, there's a whole variation where you do need to play this kind of figuration all in the right hand, so I'll cover that option in more depth when we get to that part. For these marked trills, I find it easiest to plan to play the exact same number of notes each time, rather than leaving them unmeasured. I do 9 notes, broken up into 4 plus 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1. For these trills, I'm still using some forearm rotation, but compared with the trills I do with fingers 3 and 5, I also use a bit more finger movement here. For that, I find that it helps to keep these knuckles relatively high. Next up, we got these chromatic scales. When I think about scales, I think about fish. And when I think about fish, it makes me think of lakes. And lakes remind me of summer camp. So I'm going to tell you a story about when I was a kid. Once upon a time, I was walking along and I encountered a wall. I decided it would be fun to jump over the wall, so I did. But either I misjudged the height or just overestimated my ability to jump because I did not clear the wall. One foot caught on the top and I flipped over and did a faceplant. Or at least I would have faceplanted, but instead I instinctively put one hand out in front of me, flipped the rest of the way over, and landed on my feet before I even knew what had happened. I like to imagine it looked pretty cool. Anyway, that's pretty much how I play scales, too. Hopefully not the part about awkwardly tripping everything up, but the idea of moving in such a way that I don't even have to think about putting my next finger down, it just happens instinctively. So, how do I do that? Well, let's take a look. Every time I move my arm, whether side to side, up and down, rotating, or whatever, my fingers move too, even if I'm not actively wiggling my finger joints. So I can play a note just by moving my arm with very little finger exertion. And if I want to play 2 notes, I can just roll my hand from the first note to the second. That rolling movement gets my thumb closer to the keyboard too, so it's quite easy to add a 3rd note. Depending on how fast I roll my hand over, I can make the tempo slow or fast. In fact, there's actually no limit to how fast I can play these 3 notes. At a slow tempo, they sound like a scale. But as I increase the tempo, they gradually start sounding more like a rolled chord, and then a blocked chord. I actually only encounter limitations to how fast I can play when I have to either repeat a note I've just played, or move my hand. So those are the two elements I want to focus on as I'm working out my technique. For repeating notes, I want to make the movement as efficient as possible, so my finger stays in contact with the key, and I don't even necessarily lift it all the way back to the top before I press it down again. And when I move my hand to a different position, I want to make that movement as efficient as possible too. And set up as many other fingers as I can in the process. As I play these next few notes, I'm once again sliding my thumb into position to start the next group, and the process continues. And that's basically how I play fast scales. Beyond that, it's just a matter of fine-tuning the choreography so that each hand position flows smoothly into the next. Here, the biggest choice you'll have to make is whether to play this cadenza with one hand or two. I've seen it done both ways, so it's mostly personal preference, but I find it a bit easier with both hands. Fingering-wise, I put my right thumb on the E, and then my left thumb on the C double sharp. After that, I use 3 in the right for every white key, and 2 for every black key. In the left hand, it's the opposite. 3 on the black keys, and 2 on the white. Since my left arm is crossing over my torso, by the time I get to the top of the scale, my forearm is going to be almost parallel to the keyboard, so it feels very natural to line 3 up with the black keys and 2 with the white, while maintaining a pretty neutral wrist. But like most parts of this piece, there are lots of options, so experiment a bit to see what works best for you. For these trills, I do the first 2 sets with both hands. Then I switch to right hand alone for the third set. Since I'm going to end up trilling with 3 and 5 on the third set, I go ahead and start using finger 3 all the way from the first trill. For the last trill, I like to really emphasize this marcato accent. This takes more force and results in a bigger rebound after the note compared with the other notes in the trill. So to give my hand plenty of time to rebound before I start trilling with the right hand alone, I sneak in one more left hand note after the marcato. Next we come to these weak finger trills with octaves. This can be a pretty delicate figuration, so my number one tip is just not to try to go faster than you really can. Depending on the day and the instrument and whether or not you've warmed up, this might be slightly different each time. So I always like to ease into it a bit so I can kind of test the waters and find what's comfortable. For the movement itself, there are a few things I've found that help me. First, I'm very conscious of relaxing all the fingers that aren't involved in the movement. With really awkward patterns like this, I always find that my hand wants to tense up too much and try to brute force it, but that doesn't really work. Instead, I want to find the path of least exertion, and relaxing my inactive fingers is a good start. I also turn my thumb out pretty far. Although this isn't the most relaxed position for the thumb, it does make it easier to reach down to the low octave. So this is a bit of a compromise. If my hands were bigger, I probably wouldn't do this quite so much, but as it is, I find it easier than moving the rest of my hand way over every time I go to play a thumb note. I'm also trying to hit the low D sharp right on the edge of the key to avoid stretching any farther than I have to. That said, notice how far my thumb does move to the right between low notes. This accomplishes 2 things. First, it allows me to relax the stretch in my hand. Reaching an octave between fingers 1 and 3 is a pretty uncomfortable stretch for me. So if I kept my hand in that shape for long, I would very quickly get tired. This movement also allows me to generate some of the momentum used to play the trill with my arm. See how my forearm is actually sliding over quite a bit as my pinky goes to the E. I'm basically pivoting on finger 3 and just rolling my hand over to hit the pinky note. I don't want to do any more work with the pinky than I actually have to. To help with pivoting on the third finger, I try to maintain a bit of height at this joint, but because of the stretch down to the thumb, I don't want to go too high, as bringing that knuckle up does cut into how far I can stretch my thumb. So there are a lot of variables to optimize here. This next part might look harder because now the hand has to jump octaves in addition to trilling, but I actually find it quite a bit more comfortable. Since now there's only ever one note at a time in the right hand, there's less need to maintain a stretched position. So I relax my hand at every opportunity. Especially as I pass through the middle octave, my hand is often quite closed, but even when I do have to stretch as wide as an octave, I only maintain this stretch for a split second before closing my hand again. A closed hand is a happy hand. This next part can be kind of hard. In fact, the whole piece is hard. In fact, life is hard. But actually, I don't think this part is as hard as it looks, so that's some good news anyway. The fingering I use here depends on whether I'm playing black keys or white keys. If the first note of the group is a black key, I use 1, 3, 5, 3. If it's a white key, I use 1, 4, 5, 4. Just like the last couple sections, I'm trying to minimize the work my weak fingers have to do here by generating most of the movement in my arm instead of my fingers. Notice how my whole hand shifts to the right as I go up to the higher octave. Just like in the last section, I'm pivoting on this finger, and my pinky is traveling, along with the rest of my whole hand, up to its note. There's still some engagement in this joint right as I get to the high note, but I'm not thinking of the finger itself as the primary force behind playing the note. I find that the groups starting on white keys are the hardest, especially this one that starts on B. Here, my fourth finger has to clear all these speed bumps, and I can't even play too close to the front of the keys because my pinky has to get far enough back to play on the black key next. So for this group, I really have to throw my hand pretty far forward, up, and to the right. Fortunately, Liszt has been kind enough to give us mostly black keys. When the third finger is on a black key and the pinky is on a white, I turn my hand pretty far to the right so that my pinky and middle finger are almost lined up vertically, with the third finger close to the front of the black key. And when both fingers are on black keys, I slide the third finger to the back of the key so the pinky can play right at the front edge of its key. At the end of this section, we get this little mini cadenza. The first part is just a chromatic scale, so don't be intimidated by all the accidentals. For this arpeggio coming down, there are probably tons of options, but I choose to take everything in the right hand except these 4 notes, which I take with the left. With these really fast runs, I'm always trying to think of moving to whole hand positions rather than individual notes. Notice how right here, before I even play a single note with my left hand, I've already got all 4 fingers I'm about to use set up on the keys they're about to play. I do the same thing with the arpeggio that comes back up. Immediately after playing the low bass note, my right hand is already coming into position to play its first 3 notes. As I finish playing those right hand notes, my left hand is setting up its next group. Notice how here I'm playing with 5-4-2 rather than stronger fingers such as 4-2-1. If this arpeggio were a few octaves lower, I probably would use 4-2-1. But here I'm crossing over my torso, so my arm is coming in at quite an angle, and 5-4-2 lets me keep a neutral wrist. The takeaway here is that the best fingering in one register is not always the best fingering in a different register, and sometimes stuff like wrist angle and hand comfort take precedence over using the strongest fingers. That said, 4-2-1 is probably fine as well, so it's partly just personal preference. Okay, that's it for the second part. I hope you enjoyed it. In the third part, we'll be looking at the remainder of the piece.